Welcome to the 80s with me, Jamie Fenderson. Today we're going to talk about 1984. And you can't talk about 1984 without talking about 1984. What I mean by that is there are a number of works of media titled 1984. So 1984 was the title of George Orwell's famous book about oppressive totalitarianism, written in 1949. They actually made a movie based on it. It was released on December 14th, 1984. We have a podcast where we talk all about the book and compare it to the film and the events of 1984. You should check it out. What I will say here is that 1984 was 35 years into Orwell's future when it was published. 1984 is 40 years in the past for you and I. That's right. George Orwell was half a decade closer to 1984 in 1949 than we are today. How does that make you feel? Makes me feel old. Even more sad than that, though, is the fact that we still have Orwellian-style totalitarian regimes in the world today in 2024. So doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. Another piece of media titled 1984 is the Apple Computers TV commercial. It cost $900,000 to make, which is like $2.2 million today, and considered the creator of the Super Bowl commercial. So it was literally $1 million minute, long before, Super Bowl commercials started today. And it was directed by Ridley Scott. So this commercial was directed by Ridley Scott. Isn't that crazy? So I'm recording this episode not long after Microsoft shut half the world down with its blue screen and semicolon parentheses sad face. So this ad might be pretty relevant still 40 years later. The last piece of media titled 1984 we'll talk about is the epic Van Halen album 1984, released on January 9th. 1984. You might recognize the cover. It's a painting of a baby angel smoking cigarettes. That angel baby thing is actually called a puto, and the cover art was painted by Margot Z. Nahas. It was the last album to have David Lee Roth until 2012's Different Kind of Truth. Rolling Stones named it number 81 on the 100 best or 100 greatest albums of the 1980s. It's got Panama, Hot for Teacher, and Jump. I love Jump, dude. It's so good. It's Van Halen's only number one single on the Billboard Top 100, believe it or not. All the hits they had, this was the only number one on the Billboard Top 100. And I love the rock. I love the synth. And I declare this the anthem that defines 1984. It was number 15 on VH1's 100 Greatest Songs of the 1980s, listed on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum's 500 Songs That Shaped Rock and Roll, and it's been voted one of the greatest songs for sporting events. So let's keep talking about music, and in the 80s, it's hard not to talk about Michael Jackson when you talk about music. By this time, he was pretty much the most famous person alive. He was presented with a record 8 Grammys in February. Not only for Thriller, but he won one for narrating a children's recording of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Michael Jackson recording a narration of the children's version of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, that's about as 80s as you can get. So something bad happened to Michael Jackson, though. He got burned recording a Pepsi commercial. Pretty bad. It burned his scalp. Like one of the lights caught his pomade in his hair on fire, and it really hurt him. And they even think that maybe this is when he got addicted to pain pills. So that's a bummer. So now we got to talk about Prince. If anyone was as big as Michael Jackson in 1984, it was Prince. The album Purple Rain was released on June 25th, and it was awesome. The pop, rock, R&B, funk album had a number of fantastic songs, including the titular Purple Rain. I Would Die for You, Let's Go Crazy, and When Doves Cry, which was #1 on the Billboard Top 100 Songs of 1984. Certified platinum. There's some critics poll that calls it the best single of 1984. Top-selling single of 1984. Number 37 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 Songs That Shaped Rock and Roll. Album cover is so cool. Prince is just like hanging out in his purple outfit on a motorcycle in a city at night. And he's like either arriving or leaving a beautiful girl's apartment. It's pretty cool, right? So not satisfied with an outstanding album, just releasing that, he also made a movie. He started his feature-length film of the same name, and it didn't suck. It was actually really good. And Prince had a nightmare that Siskel and Ebert tore the movie apart, but they both gave it thumbs up. They got 2 thumbs up. And it made more than $70 million on a $7.2 million budget, so he made a little dough. So I'm going to talk about one more big music star in 1984. Then I have to stop and move on because I could have a whole weekly podcast just about the music of 1984. To complete the triad of musical royalty, I'm going to talk about the queen of pop herself, Madonna. On November 13th, oh no, that's November 12th, 1984, she released the album Like a Virgin. It was the #1 album on the Billboard's 200, first female artist to sell over 5 million copies in the US, would be certified diamond later. Tracks include Like a Virgin, Material Girl, and Dress You Up. In 2023, last year, the album was selected for preservation in the US Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. So there you go. MJ, Prince, and Madonna. Doesn't get any more 80s than that. If you want to know more about musicians from 1982, who the big pop stars were, then you should look at the video for Do They Know It's Christmas, which was like a charity thing to raise money for the Ethiopian famine. Pretty much has every big pop star in 1984. So you can look at that video and check out all the other pop stars. So do that because we got to move on because there's just too much goodness in 1984. I got to pick and choose, you know what I'm saying? So let's go into movies and let's talk about PG-13. I wrote a short article about PG-13 and it's mostly due to one man, Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg had been pushing the limits of PG and rated R since the 70s. It's almost like he's saying to R, I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. But there were 2 big films in 1984 that finally pushed parents over the edge. One of them was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the #3 highest grossing film of 1984, directed by Steven Spielberg. And it was great, awesome adventure, but it also had monkey brains and a scary shaman ripping the still beating heart out of a guy before he sacrifices him to fire. Yeah, kind of scary for kids, right? And then Gremlins, which was just below that, #4 highest grossing film, directed by Joe Dante, written by Chris Columbus. It's about little monsters murdering townspeople. And then there's the scene where the mom blows one of them up in a microwave and blends another creature up in the blender. Pretty violent. So parents were pissed. But the industry wanted Steven and others to do their thing because their movies were making buttloads of money. This was like a golden age for film, the 1980s, especially with teen audiences. So thus, 1984 rated PG-13 was born. And I think Steven Spielberg actually suggested that they make that. And the first rated PG-13 movie was in 1984. It was Red Dawn, the movie about communists invading America and they're shooting up kids and the kids got to fight back. Yeah, that was the first rated PG-13 movie. Let's talk about some of the other big blockbusters of 1984. The highest grossing film of the year was Ghostbusters. We have a whole 40th anniversary podcast episode just about Ghostbusters, so go check that out. And #2 was Beverly Hills Cop, starring Eddie Murphy. And this really cemented Eddie Murphy as a big movie megastar. I just watched the new Netflix sequel recently, and I liked it. And I'm the kind of guy who doesn't like sequels or reboots. You guys know that. But this was actually a lot of fun. It was just a good Beverly Hills Cop movie. It's not trying to be something it's not. It's just a. It's got enough nostalgia to make it fun, but it's a Beverly Hills Cop movie. Eddie Murphy, a lot of people don't know this, but I'm bringing it back out to the light, was also in another movie this year, a forgotten turd called Best Defense. It was originally a Dudley Moore film, but they shoved Eddie Murphy into it, and it was awful. So we have a whole review about Best Defense on the 80s and 90s overlooked YouTube channel. You really need to check this out because we're shining light on this turd. And then The Karate Kid was number 5 at the box office. I love The Karate Kid. And they would go on to create one of the coolest shows of the modern era, Cobra Kai. We have a whole episode about how much we love Cobra Kai. You should check that out. Some cast trivia. So that yellow classic 1948 Ford that Daniel was waxing was given to Ralph Macchio as a gift, and he still owns it. Pat Morita designed the Miyagi-Do Banzai logo. He did. William Zabka still owns that red leather jacket that he wore in the movie. And Elizabeth Shue interrupted her studies at Harvard to star in this film. Can you believe that? And then even though Martin Kove, the guy who played Kreese, everybody, I mean, he looks like a complete asshole, right? But I guess he got along with everybody because he's in real life, he's a super nice guy. And he got along well with everybody. All his castmates love him. So he's totally not how he is in the movie or on the show. So I love science fiction and fantasy. So we're going to talk a little bit about science fiction. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. That came out in 1984. And sometimes it's criticized for not being a very good Star Trek movie, but I would beg to differ. It's a great film. It's about sacrifice and friendship, and it introduces Klingons in a better way, and it's got like the Klingon bird of prey, which would go on to be seen in all the future movies, almost all of them. So I like that Star Trek movie. And then The Last Starfighter. That's so cool, right? So a kid from a trailer park goes on a space adventure. So I was a kid in a trailer park who loved video games, so I could really kind of like dream about this. So all the space scenes were CGI, which was actually pretty great for 1984. It was rendered by Digital Productions. Interesting name, pretty pretty basic. It was on called a Cray X MP supercomputer. And so there are 300 scenes, and each frame had approximately 250,000 polygons. And it had like 3,000 by 5,000 36-bit pixels. This was pretty heavy at the time, but it cost half as much as doing it with models. So this is like the precursor to modern cost-saving CGI was on The Last Starfighter. And everything was like programmed in Fortran. Do you guys know Fortran? Is anybody still programming that? That's funny. The Terminator, James Cameron's sci-fi classic, created a whole film franchise. That's crazy, right? And then Dune. There's some bad criticism about 1984's Dune, but I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. I think the new movies do a good job, though, because they cut this really long story up, which I think is a good idea. Runaway, starring Tom Selleck. I thought that's kind of scared me when I was a kid. Kirstie Alley and Gene Simmons from Kiss was the bad guy. It's about killer robots and like heat seeker bullets, and it's pretty good. I would suggest it. I think it's overlooked. Starman, starring Jeff Bridges, which is like a sci-fi romance. And speaking of sci-fi romance, there's a movie called Electric Dreams that Milo and I reviewed on the 80s and 90s overlooked. You should check that out. It's kind of a love triangle with a boy, a girl, and a computer. It's actually a pretty good movie, and it's very overlooked, so I think you should check it out. I think it's streaming on a number of services for free. You should watch that. Let's talk a little bit about fantasy movies. So Conan the Destroyer, the sequel to Conan the Barbarian. So Arnold was in 2 movies in 1984. One as a killer cyborg and one as a killer barbarian. He's tearing it up in 1984. And then we got to talk about the never-ending story. Ah, ah, ah. Every kid in 1984 loved this movie. And we wish we were like a Treyu and we had a luck dragon. It was awesome. And it had that cool song I just butchered just now by Lamal, and with the crazy 80s hair. But he also has it's really a duet with a female vocalist. Her name is Beth Anderson. And did you know she also is a voice actress for a number of animated films, just including some of them, The Brave Little Toaster, The Swan Princess, and Disney's Tarzan. So, that's something I learned. And in the world of horror, A Nightmare on Elm Street was released in 1984. I was too young to watch this, but I still watched it because 80s parents just didn't give a shit. I should not have been watching this. So I'm still, he's become kind of a farce of himself now, but back then, Freddy Krueger was scary, y'all. I shouldn't have been watching that at all in 1984. Then you had a number of dancing movies. So Footloose was a big movie, and it had that song with Kenny Loggins. It was all about dancing. Even though the town didn't want them to dance, they danced anyway. And then there were some break dancing movies, which I learned people prefer calling it breaking, not break dancing. So that's a new thing, or that's a new thing I learned anyway. And these movies were Breakin' and Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. So Breakin' and Breakin' 2 both came out in 1984. This must be one of the few things where the movie comes out and then not long after in the same year the sequel comes out. So I think that's interesting because breaking was in the Olympics. And in fact, as you're listening to this, it's probably over. So go check to see who won what medals for breaking. And we have a whole podcast just about breaking and break dancing. You should go check that out. Yeah, break dancing was huge in the 80s, and it's always, and it's just perpetuated ever since. It's such a cool art form. So speaking of Olympics, we can combine events and sports because the 1984 Olympics was the big thing that year. So the Olympics were held in Los Angeles, and I guess it was like one of the only Olympics that was profitable for the city, for the host city, because LA actually kind of bailed out the Olympics by saying, yeah, we'll do it, because I guess nobody really wanted to. But they said, hey, as long as we don't have to build anything new, so we're going to use existing pro and college sports venues. So they did. They didn't build anything. They just prepared and used what they had. And so this is one of the only reasons, or one of the only times the Olympics was profitable for a city that hosted it. The Eastern Bloc boycotted the Olympics in response to the 1980 U.S.-led boycott of Moscow Olympics. And it's interesting, so the USSR, which included a bunch of countries that are their own countries now, boycotted it, as well as East Germany, because that was a thing back then. Country that doesn't exist anymore because it unified with West Germany. It's just Germany now. Czechoslovakia boycotted it. Again, that's two countries now. And Poland. And I just think 40 years later, you'd never see a country like Germany or Poland like aligning with Russia about any of this kind of stuff. These countries are pretty like not into the Russian thing these days, but back then they were part of that Iron Curtain sphere of influence. It's pretty crazy. And Russia only has like 15 Olympians in the Olympics this year, because they can't even compete under their own flag because of all the doping and stuff. So times have changed, man. So Mary Lou Retton was a gymnast, and she was America's champion in 1984. She won gold, probably because the Russians weren't there. But that's neither here nor there. If you don't compete, you can't get anything, right? And she was in commercials and on Wheeze boxes. We have a whole podcast just talking about her because she was in the news not long ago. She had a GoFundMe account to help pay her medical bills because she couldn't afford health insurance, which I think that's so sad, but to me that sounds like the most American thing ever, where you have an American hero who was literally wearing stars and stripes and winning gold medals on behalf of her country, can't even afford health insurance. That's pretty much the most American thing I've ever heard. So I want to talk about two books in 1984 that were released in 1984. Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion is one of them, by Robert B. Cialdini. This is a life-changing book. I read this when I was in university, and it's all about how people use psychology to persuade others and to even manipulate others. And if you really want to like be impervious to psychological manipulation, this book is a must-read. This is a good read. Even if you're in sales, marketing, or even if you just are just a person and you want to know how people influence you and how marketers influence you and how politicians influence you, this is a book that you must read. I suggest it for anybody. And then the other is Neuromancer by William Gibson. It won a bunch of awards for best science fiction book. And I think it was like the first one to win the big three. Trippy book. It's considered kind of the father of cyberpunk. So it's got all the cyberpunk genre thing going on, but it's very trippy the way it's written. It's kind of mind-blowing, and some people might not get it, but if you can really kind of dive into this, it's a trippy book, and I really suggest reading this. Neuromancer by William Gibson, one of my favorites, if not my favorite book in the whole world. Let's talk about food history. So the Costco hot dog was introduced in 1984, and guess how much it was, guys? It was $1.50, and it's been $1.50 for 40 years. It hasn't changed. So you get a hot dog and a soda with a free refill for $1.50. That's cool, right? It's still $1.50. I don't know how they do it. I actually worked at Costco Travel IT for a number of years, and I will say Costco is a good company. It was good to work for. I like shopping there. Costco's on my good list. And then Wendy's, "Where's the beef?" commercial premiered on television. Remember those old ladies? They're like, "Where's the beef?" And then in the 80s, it became a catchphrase, and I think you still hear older people like me saying, like, "Where's the beef?" And it became a phrase that questions the substance of a product or idea. So if a guy at work comes to you and talks very surface level about an idea, you could be like, "Where's the beef?" Use that next time at work. See if that goes down with like the younger generation. See if they still understand that. So you may have seen that commercial on these TV shows that debuted in 1984. So some of the sitcoms, The Cosby Show was huge. Cosby was America's dad. He got into trouble later, but he was our TV dad. He was everybody's TV dad back then. Who's the Boss with Tony Danza and Alyssa Milano. Night Court. I love Night Court. We have an episode where we compare Cheers versus Night Court. We have a podcast episode. You definitely need to check that out. And Charles in the Charge, starring Scott Baio. Some drama, mystery, and crime shows. Miami Vice debuted in 1984. This was huge. This became kind of where you went to see what the latest kind of tropical fashion was or what the coolest music was. Very fashionable show. Murder, She Wrote, starring Angela Lansbury. That would be a long one. They'd go all the way to 96, and it's all about her. Like, she's just an author writing about murder mysteries, but she goes around everywhere she goes. Someone actually gets murdered, and she's got to help some detectives solve it. You need to stay away from Jessica, man. You know someone's going to die. And then another one, Highway to Heaven, starring Michael Landon. It's kind of a sweet show. My mom liked that show. And then in action, you had Airwolf, one of the coolest theme songs of all time. And every kid and probably every guy in general wanted a cool Airwolf helicopter. And the show Hunter premiered. And a big show that's still on today, Jeopardy, premiered. Wow, can you believe it? 40 years, and it's still going strong. R.I.P. Alex Trebek. You'll always be our host. Some cartoons: Muppet Babies, Voltron, Snorks, and Rainbow Bright all debuted in 1984. And then if you were a kid in 1984, you were also watching Punky Brewster. And if you had cable, or your grandma had cable like mine did, you were also watching KIDS, Kids Incorporated. We have a whole podcast about Kids Incorporated, believe it or not. I love that show, and I think you should check out our episode about that. So there you have it, 1984, according to Jamie Fenderson. Do you remember 1984? Let me know. Comment wherever you're listening to this podcast. And with that, I will say I'm out of here like Madonna's virginity as she was touched for the very first time. See you in 1985.